Hello and welcome to this Local Government Association webinar on the effective chairing of remote meetings. Today you'll hear from Councillor Peter Fleming, the leader of Sevenoaks District Council and Chairman of the Local Government Association Improvement and Innovation Board. Also from Councillor David Renard, the leader of Swindon Borough Council and Chairman of the Local Government Association Board covering economy, environment, housing and transport. From Councillor Sharma Tatler of the London Borough of Brent, who is the lead member for Regeneration, Property and Planning, and from myself, Alison Edwards. So, this webinar builds on other resources which you can find on the LGA website and can be accessed after the session. Our resources are available from the website under the Highlighting Political Leadership pages or from the Remote Meetings Hub. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of the London Office of Technology and Innovation for their assistance in providing some of the material in this webinar. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Councillor Peter Fleming.
So I'm filming today's webinar from my empty chamber, not knowing when it's going to be full of councillors, the public and officers again. Today's webinar really is focused on bringing together all of the resources and the experience of the LGA and councils so that you've got a go-to resource.
Thank you, Peter. So today's session will take you through a number of areas. We'll talk about some basic good practice principles around the holding of remote meetings. We will touch on how remote meetings and face-to-face meetings are in many ways quite similar. We'll talk a little bit about how remote meetings work and some of the technology around it. We'll talk a little bit more about putting it into practice, and we'll hear from Sharma and David on their experiences of chairing and taking part in remote meetings in the last couple of months. We'll then talk a little bit about how democracy and voting is undertaken using remote meeting, provide you with a few hints and tips, and signpost you towards some resources that can be accessed after the session. So, as I said, this is a webinar on the chairing of remote meetings. However, many of the principles that we would employ when undertaking face-to-face meetings in our council chambers and our meeting rooms, with our residents' associations and tenants, or indeed with our officers or fellow councillors, will also apply to remote meetings. So many of the things that we talk about will be familiar to you from your experiences to date. However, there are some aspects of remote meetings which will be new to you. So we shall talk about the similarities and indeed some of the differences.
So the first part of today's webinar is really by way of introduction. I'm just going to set out a few of the hints and tips that I've picked up over the last few weeks, and hopefully that will serve as a taster for what is, I think, a really amazing resource in terms of the rest of the information that you'll get from the video today.
Thank you, Peter. So, since the middle of March, council staff and councillors across the UK are now working remotely. We're no longer able to meet in our council chambers and our meeting rooms, in our town halls and our district council premises. We're finding that we're having to adapt to a new way of undertaking our council business, whether we're officers or councillors. And of course, not being able to meet in the way that we're used to presents us with a number of challenges, not least of all for holding traditional council meetings. We're very used to face-to-face interaction, reading the body language of our fellow councillors, our officers and our residents, understanding the subtle nuances of what people say in meetings, and perhaps undertaking business in what would seem to be a much more personable and friendly way. However, recently we've had to get used to not only a new way of doing our business, but also some new language. We're getting used to technology We're getting used to words such as Zooming and having a Zoom meeting, getting used to undertaking something called a Microsoft Teams meeting, or perhaps asking people whether they want to take part in a Google Hangouts meet, or perhaps even Skyping people. And this has not only changed the way we do our business as councillors in our council chambers and meeting rooms, but it's also changed the etiquette of participating in meetings. And of course, many of our meetings now have to be done online. And this will include our full council meetings, our committee meetings, some statutory meetings such as planning and licensing, as well as public meetings and meetings with the public. So my first tip for this webinar is to find out what technology your council is using, because each of these platforms work in a slightly different way, and their functions and the way in which you interact with them is slightly different. So knowing the technology is key. So your role in meetings, whether they're meetings face-to-face or meetings remotely, I suppose it could be summed up in two ways really. It's to give your residents or members of the public confidence that the business of the council will be carried out in accordance with the council's constitution and its procedural rules. And summing this up, what this really means is that as a councillor, you've been elected to represent those people in your ward or division who voted for you and provide and put you into office, and indeed those people who didn't vote for you, but you still represent them on the council as an elected member. And in doing that, you need to undertake that role in accordance with the council's constitution and the procedural rules of acting as an elected member for your local authority. But also, your job, particularly when chairing a meeting, is to make sure that meetings are run effectively and inclusively, but they are done in line with any agreed agenda, but also to deal with the business at hand in the meeting itself. And of course, this doesn't just include the conduct in the meeting itself, it's also about the preparation for a meeting and the follow-up. And of course, this is the same whether you're undertaking a face-to-face meeting or through remote meeting technology. So the principles are very much the same. It's just the method which is different. So thinking about our preparation, and it might strike you as a little bit strange that my first bullet point says, is a meeting the right way to deal with the issue? But what I think I'm trying to say here is that perhaps we're very used to having meetings. We do like to have meetings to talk about things, to discuss things, to undertake our business in a very efficient way. But perhaps remote meeting technology offers us an alternative. Maybe we can do things a little bit differently, and maybe a full meeting involving lots of people isn't necessarily always the right way to deal with the issue. And we also have other ways of communicating still, telephones, emails, doing things in a way which perhaps don't involve a formal meeting. However, that's really just to think about. So I suppose the first thing you need to think about when preparing for a meeting is, what is it the meeting is setting out to achieve? What are the objectives of the meeting? And this is particularly important with remote meetings, because people need to know what the purpose of the meeting is going to be and what we're hoping to achieve. Certainly as a chair, it's very important to know what is on the agenda, being clear what the agenda will cover, what needs to be covered in the course of the meeting, and the timeframes for doing that becomes even more important. Are there other people who should attend? Remote meeting technology offers us a great opportunity to be even more inclusive in our meetings. Where space is no longer at a premium, and we don't need to think about whether there will be enough chairs for people to sit on, we have an amazing opportunity to invite people to attend who perhaps wouldn't necessarily be able to attend a more usual face-to-face meeting. So think about whether there are other people that might be able to attend your meetings now you're holding them online. My next point is about ensuring you're there on time. And this is key because with remote meeting technology, there is a start time and a finish time for the meeting. So making sure you're there to start the meeting, if you're its host or you're chairing it, is absolutely vital. And my final point is about making time to be there. This is one of those times when looking at your emails or answering a WhatsApp message is just not good etiquette when you're undertaking a remote meeting, or perhaps a face-to-face one. But making sure you're present and in the meeting is extremely important. So in the meeting itself, I suppose your role as a chair is to welcome your fellow participants. There may well be many small faces on a screen. It's important that everybody knows who's in the meeting. Listen before speaking. One of the key things with remote meetings is to ensure that not everybody tries to speak at the same time. Usually with meetings, you can only really have one person talking at any point in time. So your role as a chair may well be to listen carefully to what is said before speaking. Your role as chair is very much to concentrate on the process, the conduct, the flow of a meeting, rather than necessarily the detail of what's being discussed. I would also say this is a really good opportunity to use eye contact and body language to encourage people to speak. It's quite difficult in a remote meeting where we don't actually have someone sitting in front of us or to the side of us to nod or smile or gesticulate to encourage someone to take part. But we can still do this by remote meeting, and encouraging people by using their name or asking them to speak, or if they'd like to say something, is a really good way to ensure good participation in your meeting. I would also say the use of skillful questions will really help you achieve good results with your remote meetings. Making sure that people get the opportunity to ask questions, to have them answered, becomes very important. My last 2 points are really about managing the meeting. I suppose it's also to ensure, even more than perhaps in face-to-face meetings, that all agenda items on that meeting get a fair discussion. Sometimes remote meetings have to be undertaken in a relatively short time frame, so make sure you manage the agenda carefully so that all the items that need to be discussed get a fair hearing. And my last point really is about managing interventions, particularly those from members of the public. And we'll come on to participation by members of the public in a little while. But bear in mind that with remote meeting technology, you may very well have people there who are members of the public and not just councillors or officers. And my last point now, at the close of the meeting, it's very important to know who is going to do what, by when, especially if the who is you. So your role as a chair is to make sure that items that haven't been followed up or resolved in a meeting are done afterwards, and the issues can be resolved and that you know who's going to do that. Certainly clarify how outstanding issues will be resolved, particularly with a remote meeting, because again, often there are more people involved and you may very well have to report back to people on what the outcome of something will be, what the documentation that will follow up a meeting will be. And make sure you give feedback to those who need it, whether they're fellow councillors, officers, members of the public, community groups. So a little bit more on the mechanics of remote meetings itself now. Well, basically, remote meetings work a little bit like this. They work with a group of participants, all of whom have the opportunity on a remote meeting to talk to one another, full participation, conversations and screen sharing of documents or PowerPoints or slides or photographs between those participants. And these participants, I suppose, usually would be your fellow councillors. They may be officers of the council as well. However, the main difference between a traditional face-to-face meeting and perhaps a remote meeting is that you may well have people who have the opportunity to observe rather than participate in the meeting. And these may often be either other councillors or members of the public or officers. And they have the opportunity not only to see what is being broadcast to them in the conduct of the meeting itself, but also to send in comments, usually through some kind of chat function or question and answer function. So remember, your face-to-face meetings may well have fewer participants than your remote meetings. And remember that the observers have the opportunity to see the proceedings and to comment. So let's talk a little bit more about the technology now.
The first thing to think about really is what platform you're going to use. Which bit of technology is going to work best for your members, for officers, and also for members of the public who may want to watch your meeting. On the LGA website, we have a number of resources, including a list of all of the major platforms with the pros and cons of each of them. So that's a really great place to start, to think about what will work best for you.
Thank you, Peter. So, a little bit more about the technology. And we've talked a little bit about this previously, but I suppose there are three main video platforms that councils seem to be using at the moment. There is something called Google Hangouts Meet, Microsoft Teams, and Zoom. And they all offer a functionality that can support observers in the meeting. So Google Hangout Meets offer something called a live stream. Zoom will refer to this as a video webinar, whereas Microsoft Teams call it live events. And of course, each of those platforms also enables those observers to pose written questions, usually through some form of chat function. So again, as Peter said, it's important to find out what platform your council is using. Now we're going to hear from David Reynard, the leader of Swindon Borough Council, about his experience of remote meetings.
Hello, I'm Councillor David Reynard, leader of Swindon Council, and also the chair of the Local Government Association Board covering economy, environment, housing and transport. I've run a number of virtual council and LGA meetings, and I've been asked to share my experiences. Virtual meetings cannot replace the experience of a traditional meeting where everyone is in the same room, and there are some nuances and adaptations which have to be made. Particularly, it's not easy for a chair to judge the mood of the meeting. In my view, small meetings work well virtually, but not so well when there are large numbers of attendees. However, they do enable the democratic process to continue and are now an important alternative which can and should be used when necessary. For this training module, I'm going to discuss how to run a meeting using Microsoft Teams specifically, but it's a similar process using Zoom or other platforms. So why should we hold virtual meetings? During the current time when gathering together in enclosed spaces is not permitted, holding virtual meetings enables councils to meet their statutory duties and ensure that key decisions at committees such as Cabinet, Planning and Licensing can be met. It's important that the business of the council continues and that decisions affecting the local economy are not delayed. Demonstrating that the democratic process can continue in an open and transparent way is also important for the places we lead. Pre-planning virtual meetings is essential, especially if this is your first time at organising and chairing such a meeting. Council officers will set up a test meeting and invite everyone to log in via their meeting request. This will enable everyone to test their broadband connections, equipment, video and audio, and give plenty of time to resolve any issues which may arise. Officers will usually only have their audio on, but members must be heard and should only turn off their videos if they're having bandwidth problems. When setting up the real meeting, there needs to be one for elected members and officers and a separate one for members of the public and the media to log on to. This is to ensure that there are no unwelcome interruptions during the meeting, as has happened on at least one occasion. Adequate notice should be given to the public to give them the opportunity to ask questions at the meeting. They will need to do this by the deadline given in your constitution. These can then be responded to at the meeting by the relevant member and a written response sent. A day or so before the main meeting, an officer will usually draw up a chair's agenda to ensure that those attending can be briefed on how the virtual meeting will work. I would advise that the chair uses two devices in meetings, one for running the meeting and another to follow the reports unless hard copies are to hand. Switching between applications will be time-consuming and interrupt the flow of the meeting. Just before the actual meeting, it's recommended that all participants log in 15 to 20 minutes beforehand to ensure that connections, audio and video are working. The chair and the IT officer will ensure that everyone can be heard, which is the minimum legal requirement. 5 minutes before the start of the meeting, the chair should run through the mechanics of how he or she will be running it. This will ensure that the meeting runs smoothly, and the advice should include that if there are any technical difficulties, the meeting will be suspended until they can be resolved. All participants should set their microphones to mute, and this will reduce the amount of interference and any background noises being heard. Only the chair and current speaker should have their audio live. Everyone should have the meeting chat open on their screens, and if someone wishes to speak, they should either use the hand raise facility or indicate in the meeting chat. Not all programs or devices currently support the raise hand facility, so the chair needs to explain how he or she will be calling speakers depending on the circumstances. Raising a hand in front of the camera is not advised, as there's a limit to how many people are visible on the chair's screen, and the person concerned may not be noticed. And finally, voting will need to be effected by the chair calling the names of each voting member so that they can indicate their support or not. This does not mean that a recorded vote is taking place, but it does allow the clerk to clearly identify if the recommendations are carried or not. When the time comes to start the meeting, an officer must inform the chair when it has gone live. The chair can then welcome everyone to the meeting, noting that the public and media have joined. At the beginning of the meeting, for the benefit of the public and media, the chair should advise that the meeting will be suspended if there are any technical difficulties until they're resolved, and it should also be mentioned that the meeting is being recorded if that is the case. It's worth reminding the meeting to keep microphones on mute and to remember to unmute them if they wish to speak. As I've often seen people called, they start speaking and then forget that no one can hear them. During the meeting, the chair will call the items in the usual way. To simplify the process, the chairs may wish to allow the member of bringing the report to move it and for the chair to second every report, but that's a matter for local preference. Sometimes there are time lags between calling for someone to speak and them responding, so chairs need to allow more time than usual for responses. In my experience, virtual meetings tend to generate less debate than a physical meeting, so I would recommend allowing those few extra seconds for people to come in and contribute. Calling each voting member individually is more time-consuming than normal, especially in large meetings, but it needs to be done so that there is no doubt in which way the vote has gone. When the final vote is taken, it's clearly important to indicate that the meeting has ended, so everyone can leave and the officers close it down. No doubt we will all continue to learn as virtual meetings become more commonplace and new features are introduced, but I hope this has proved useful and wish you every success with sharing your virtual meetings.
Thank you, David. And now we'll hear from Sharma Tatler from Brent Borough Council.
Hi, I'm Councillor Sharma Tatler and I'm here today to talk about chairing online meetings, to give some hints and tips to colleagues and councillors as we navigate this new normal. Now, many of us come from councils where we have already been broadcasting live committee meetings and full council meetings, and online meetings are probably the next stage in that process. And COVID has changed the way that we connect with people, and I think that's only a good thing, particularly on this online world. We're able to connect more efficiently with other members and officers, but also be much more inclusive to residents in this way. And I think this technology is here to stay. I think this way of working is here to stay, and it's a good thing. So it enables people that haven't come to councils or engaged with councils before to do so going forward. So in order for us to really make the most of this, I think there are a few things that we need to be aware of when we're embarking on conducting online meetings. The first thing is your preparation, and the preparation, I mean understanding the technology. It's nothing worse than sitting in an online meeting and the chairs come in having no idea, just thinking he can click on or she can click onto the link and it'll be all working, wonderfully and smoothly well. A chairing of a good online meeting needs to know how the operation of the platform they're using works. So making sure you understand the functionalities of the platform, the buttons even to use, whether you're going to be using the question and answer abilities within the platform or the chat function, whether you're going to record the meeting, and how you're going to manage a meeting with the technology. Another element of that is really important, is making sure that you have the equipment to be there that enables you to be heard and for you to listen. So making sure that you've got microphones if necessary or headsets, to making sure that you're heard and you can hear others. Really, really important. Also really important is to making sure your Wi-Fi broadband connections are strong and you're sitting in a place where you can easily be seen and the camera within your laptop or smartphone or tablet is visible. So nothing that you do as much as you can really beforehand. Obviously, there are things that if you can't foresee, a technology can fail, the internet can fail, but do as much as you can beforehand. The other thing I think is really important is knowing your audience, as you would in your face-to-face meetings if we're holding them in your council chamber, is to understand the focus of the meeting, making sure there's a clear focus, a clear agenda, and a clear way of going forward so everybody knows what's coming up. Really important as well, knowing the size of your meetings. If you're going to have a large meeting, it may be worth considering having somebody else manage who gets to speak or who's next to speak, what questions are going to be answered, and keeping to time, because it can be quite difficult if you've got more than 20, 30 people on any one meeting, and also trying to manage that through the technology, as you would in any face-to-face meeting. So really important in that aspect. Secondly, I think it's really, really important that you also look at recording a meeting if you can. This way it enables you to record and minute anything that you need to minute, and also broadcast it at a later date if that's necessary. But it also allows you to catch up on things that you may have missed during the meeting while you're chairing it. So really, really good way, I think, a hint, if nothing else, is to use the record function on your online platform if that's possible at all. Another thing I think is really important, particularly if you're doing committee meetings or any large-scale meetings, is having a pre-meet, as you would in any other setting face-to-face, particularly making sure that all the key committee members or people that are going to be speaking in the meeting understand the process of what's going forward, housekeeping and keeping to time as much as possible. So you're all organised, all can be prepared as much as possible to run smoothly as possible. So key things would be preparing, knowing your audience, and making sure that the technology there is key. I think the other thing really important, I think what works really effectively for me, is the ability to share a screen. So if you have an agenda, if you have a presentation, share it so people can see exactly what you're talking about. And again, if necessary, share papers beforehand so people have got an idea of what you're talking about and referring to. So as you would in any other meeting going forward. Things I think you should be wary of and making sure that you don't do is knowing the mute button and the mute function. So if you're not speaking, mute yourself, and making sure there's no awkward sounds or going on in the background which can distract from the meeting. I think we've all heard stories about kind of microphones being left on and so on. So let's make sure that you're fully aware of that before the meeting goes ahead. Also making sure that you're not going to be interrupted as much as possible. And I know most of us are living at home, working from home and doing these meetings, but in a space, make sure you're in a space you aren't going to be interrupted on. And also, I think really important, and I think vitally important, knowing who's supposed to be at the meeting, so you don't get any people who shouldn't be there who may cause trouble or actually have no idea about the meeting at all. So everybody's briefed, so you have an idea of who the meeting attendees are going to be, so you can manage the meeting as smoothly as physically possible. Now, that may not be the case in a resident meeting, obviously, but where it's possible, make sure you try and you know who the attendees are going to be going forward.
So, thank you for that, Sharma. So, before the meeting, all participants need to be made aware of the following etiquette. So join the meeting promptly to avoid unnecessary interruptions. Remember to mute your microphone when you're not talking. And if possible, switch off your camera when you're not speaking, because this will save bandwidth on your broadband. If you'd like to speak, turn your camera on. Only speak when invited to by the chair, and state your name before you make a comment. And of course, if you're referring to a specific page or slide, mention the page or slide number. And of course, if you've got any documents that need to be referred to during the meeting, make sure you share them with participants in advance, and make sure that every page and slide has a number. And as Sharma was saying and David was saying, do your research beforehand. Remember, you may not have on-hand officer assistants in your meetings. And then, of course, if it's appropriate for your observers to be able to see documents as well, make sure you post the links to each of those documents on your council website beforehand. So, again, if you're chairing the meeting, clearly state the document on page number if you're referring to specific documents. Be very directive. It's important, particularly if there's lots of people on your meeting, to invite specific participants by name to speak or to respond to a point, particularly if you have a lot of people on your meeting. And if you're not sure who would like to speak next, invite your participants who would like to make a point to turn on their camera. This visual signal will enable you to invite them by name in turn. And when it comes to recording proceedings, committees should have a moderator to make notes to create the formal minutes. So for the smooth running of a meeting, it will help if the moderator can assist the chair in spotting who wishes to speak. And of course, if you're using a collaborative document to take votes, this person can then take responsibility for sharing the relevant document and calling out the result. So a little bit now about voting. Well, I suppose voting can be done in two ways. Perhaps the simplest way to do it is by using a kind of process. So the simplest way to record a vote would be perhaps for the chair to perform a roll call of all committee members and ask them to state their vote, which can then be captured by a moderator or officer. And of course, if all participants can be seen on the video conference, they could alternatively indicate this with a hand signal. So something like a thumb up, voting for, a thumb down, voting against, or a flat hand to vote abstain. And you may be able to do this within the video technology itself. A slightly more complicated alternative way to enable participants to vote is to write down their vote. So to do this, perhaps in advance of the meeting, you need to give exclusive access to participants to a collaborative document, such as a Google document, which all participants can then edit at the same time. And I suppose this could be laid out a little bit like it says on the screen, you know, the name and number of the candidate, of the councillor, whether candidates are voting for, against, or abstaining. And in each of those, they type their name in. When you're taking deputations or speeches from members of the public, again, some careful thinking beforehand will come in really useful here. Some meetings will need to enable members of the public to share their views. So for example, during a planning meeting. And I suppose, again, there's two ways of doing this. Perhaps the simplest option is to get those views shared in writing in advance. And of course, there's no legal requirement that committees must accept oral input from the public. Instead, committees could make it clear in advance of the meeting that all submissions must be made in writing. It could be done by sharing an email address to which they write, or by creating a simple Google form through which participants can submit their views. Make sure that you know that the deadline for making submissions is made very clear. And those submissions could be read out by someone during the meeting or chaired by combining them into one document. Alternatively, you could do this by adding people in as participants. So it's quite common practice for members of the public who wish to speak at a committee to give advance notice. So those wishing to speak could then be added in as participants rather than as observers to the meeting. In effect, this might require you to request their email address in advance of the session so that they can be sent the joining link for participants rather than observers. So when David was talking about perhaps the need to have separate arrangements for members of the public and the press, as opposed to councillors themselves, this is perhaps what we were talking about there. And those presentations from the public would then be handled in the same way as contributions from committee members. And those participants should be informed of the meeting etiquette and also again be directly invited to speak by the chair. It's also important that as chair, you make clear what the time limit is for speaking, and that perhaps you're able to give the participants notice when they have maybe 1 minute or 30 seconds remaining to speak. So, Peter.
Things will inevitably go wrong. We are reliant on, dodgy broadband, trying to get upwards of 50 people potentially all into one meeting, the public taking part, making sure that we're streaming it so that it's legal. All of these things are issues. What today's webinar will try and do is try and let you work through all of those issues and try and find those solutions beforehand. But that isn't going to stop problems occurring. And I think we have to embrace those as part of this different way of working. Practice makes perfect. That is a real truism when it comes to virtual meetings. In Sevenoaks' case, we held 3 all-member Zoom briefings prior to our first public meeting. And that meant that every member had got used to that technology, knew how it worked, knew how they looked, knew how they sounded, could find the mute, could make sure that the camera wasn't looking up their nostrils, done all of those things which are vitally important. But most important for us as an organisation, we also were able to iron out some, not all, of the issues.
So, thank you for that. At the end of a meeting, it's important to remember we're all learning, and this is something that is going to take us a little bit of time to get used to. But remember, it's key that you work with officers before the meeting, work with officers at the meeting. Also, find out who's there to support you when you're undertaking remote meetings, and never be afraid to take advice. Hopefully this webinar has been useful to you. The LGA website has a lot of information on coronavirus information for councils. Information about coronavirus more generally and remote meetings can be found on our Remote Meetings Hub. You can also find these on the LGA Political Leadership resources on the Highlighting Political Leadership website. Thank you for listening.